Okay, this will be a segment working towards a working definition of a definition of addiction. So we're going to have a brief segment about, before we define what addiction is, we're going to talk about what the experiences of addiction are. So it'll be more of a free-form conversation as opposed to the strict definition, which we're going to get to next. Okay, folks, welcome back to Addiction Alliance programming, where all you need to do is go to the internet to get some information on how to address what is called substance use disorder, otherwise known as addiction. Historically, it's been called addiction. Now, a lot of folks kind of cringe at the word addict or addiction. What we want to do next is we want to work towards a working definition of substance use disorder, of addiction, so we know what we're talking about and we're comfortable about, if treatment is addressing substance use disorder or addiction, working towards recovery from addiction, we need to know what it is. And I think you got two options. You can go to the experts and we can listen to what they have to say, the scientists and the psychologists and the therapists and the neurologists and the psychiatrists, the sociologists, the politicians, the doctors, the lawyers, or we can go straight to the source, which is the folks that experience addiction in real time, and that would be the individuals who use the drugs and the alcohol, and then of course those folks that are around them. So we call that the experiences of substance use disorder. I think we'll just call it using from now on. Since addiction is an amorphous, difficult to describe and define dynamic, and there are so many people who are interested in talking about it, we'll just call it using for right now. So what is it? The definition of using or addiction, of course, would be, how does it evolve? How do you end up how do you end up using every day or using enough that it's a binge, and then the impacts from it. So we're going to talk about that. But in the meantime, let's talk about the experiences of using. We'll leave alone how we got here for now, and we'll do a little reverse engineering, and we'll just say, okay, so now we are in the throes of substance use disorder or addiction or substance abuse, and what is that like? I want to refer back to our biopsychosocial spiritual continuum model. Again, social work and other perspectives look at a human being's life experiences, their way of life, or their lifestyle, if you will, based on a biopsychosocial spiritual framework, which means the elements of your way of life, the elements of your experiences are biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. Biological means your physical body. Psychological means your mental health, your thoughts, feelings, and your behaviors. The social piece, your relationships, your view of society, your interactions with society, and then conversely, society's attitudes towards you or your group. And then the spiritual part of life is everything else. And there are intersections between these four elements of the way of life. The biological intersects with the psychological, and with the social, and with the spiritual, and everywhere in between. So when you go biopsychosocial spiritual, there are all these different intersections. So neurology, for example, is an intersection between biology and your psychology. Relationships are interpersonal relationships are intersections between the social, the spiritual, the psychological, and the biology. If you have a kid with someone, there's a biological connection. So we see all these different intersections, and if we want to look at using drugs and the experiences that lead someone to joining this group or tuning into the material on the internet, I think we got to look at what using drugs does to us, the impact, biopsychosocially and spiritually. We're having a conversation just now about the impact on our physical health of drugs and alcohol, and boy, you can go to the internet and find a million different hits on that. most folks come into group or tune into the internet with some of those effects. For example, drinking alcohol can give you cirrhosis of the liver. Drinking alcohol can affect your neurology to the point where you have Wernicke-Korsakoff wet brain. Shooting dope can give you abscesses or HIV or hepatitis. Or, of course, your heart could stop beating from overdose. That's a physical outcome. So it's pretty manifest. Some people, all they got to do is look in the mirror and they see what drugs and alcohol have done to their health. I worked in a hospital, and, trust me, a huge percentage of health problems in this country are directly related to drug or alcohol abuse or using. Some people call sugar a drug, and we see what sugary diet does to people's health as well. So you go to any hospital and you can see the toll on society because insurance companies pay for healthcare, and this is a physical outcome of drug or alcohol abuse. Go to the internet for that information if you need it. We kind of skip that stuff because it just seems to me that most people understand the physical experiences of using drugs and alcohol. I like to talk a lot about the psychological impact, the experiences on someone's mental health, so the experiences and those what it's like to use drugs in terms of your mental health, and then the impact of drugs and alcohol on your mental health. So our psychology is based on thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and the experts will tell you that drugs affect your cognition and the way that you feel or you manage feelings. And I think this is pretty obvious. If you drink a whole bunch of alcohol or use a whole bunch of drugs, it might very well impact the way that you think. It might reinforce and heighten certain beliefs, entrenched beliefs, or you might come up with new beliefs. And then, of course, your psychology is about the way you feel or the way that you respond to feelings. And drugs and alcohol certainly exacerbate that. A good example of that is a lot of people drink because they're depressed. Listen to any country song ever before the year 2000, and it's about, drinking your sorrows away, killing the pain. That's ironic because alcohol is a depressant. So when you drink when you're depressed, it might give you a little bit of surcease. It might take away the pain for a minute, but you end up becoming more depressed usually. So the irony there, when we start talking about why, the definition of addiction is really talking about why people use. The irony is people usually use to make the feeling go away that is causing suffering, but the drugs usually make that feeling ultimately bigger, worse, and more entrenched. So I want you all to start wrapping your minds around things like, oh, I use drugs because of my anxiety. I smoke pot because of my anxiety. I shoot dope because of my anxiety, my PTSD, my anxiety, and it makes the anxiety go away. And I'll say, oh, really? What's your anxiety right now? 9 out of 10? And you used 3 hours ago? Yeah, it makes it worse. So the experiences of using drugs and alcohol in our mental health are counterproductive. We use because of feelings, and we're going to get to that in a little bit, but almost always what happens for a late stage user is it makes it worse. So the effects on our mental health of drugs and alcohol are curious because they're very counterproductive, but the net result for just about anyone I've ever met is it makes it worse. And our mental health is oftentimes what really drives us, and your mental health also impacts your physical health, your social health, and your spiritual health. So the effects on mental health for using drugs and alcohol are vast. Anxiety, depression, OCD, psychosis, delusion, the list goes on and on. Social anxiety, paranoia. I mean, you come up with an uncomfortable mental health experience, and drugs and alcohol either exacerbate it or create it. For example, if you're a trauma survivor, which means you're already hypervigilant, in your environment, you use too much meth or cocaine, and I guarantee you will eventually become psychotic and paranoid. I guarantee it. Because you're already feeling frisky. It's going to exacerbate it, and it's going to create what looks a lot like serious mental illness. It's not really serious mental illness, which is an organic bipolar schizophrenia, but it sure looks a lot like it. I mean, I've worked with probably a couple hundred people who tell me that they've been diagnosed schizophrenia or bipolar because of when they use drugs, their thoughts are delusional and fantastic and paranoid, and they approach mania and psychosis. So it has a vast impact on our mental health. Good luck living life calmly and productively if your mental health is if your mental health is compromised and your thoughts and feelings are all over the map. This is kind of a baseline condition for folks who come to work with me. And again, their physical health is usually pretty poor. Overweight, underweight, high cholesterol, disease complexities not being treated. This is important stuff. These are important experiences that we need to understand. And a lot of this is leverage of why we come to treatment. You know, you approach rock bottom, and this is because the effects of drugs and alcohol are really impacting and ruining your life. Yes?
The mental health part. So you're saying that with you already have some mental health issues before you use, right? Okay, you use and people is around, there's people. Now with me, when I use, I get yancy and I start turning up a little piece of toilet paper and stuff. I just make the people's house a mess. Mm-hmm. So that's the high, the physical.
Well, so you use a stimulant and you get agitated and you tear up a bunch of toilet paper, and then people think you're crazy because you're like a little pack rat or something. So what you're talking about is the chicken and the egg. Did you have mental health issues before you ever started using, or did the drugs cause the mental health issues? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes, and everywhere in between. People always. The reason we're having these conversations before we get into things like trauma and mindfulness and coping strategies is we got to figure out why we're here. The vast majority of the people I work with have underlying trauma-informed mental health issues. I've never, ever brought someone into group who didn't have anxiety and depression. So the big question is was I anxious and depressed baseline with like some kind of chemical imbalance? And then the drugs made it worse, or was I just fine and I used a bunch of drugs and they made me made my mental health poor? I've never met someone who credibly was just fine and they just kind of started using drugs and their life fell apart. Now, granted, I work with a Medicaid crowd, which means people who've been to prison and have endured lots of poverty and childhood abuse and all the rest. I suppose somewhere there's a white-collar facility where someone lived in this fantastic, awesome, safe world, and then through peer pressure started using drugs and their life fell apart, and we could say, drugs ruined their life. No, the people I work with, their life was already pretty rocky, started using drugs and alcohol, and it just became rockier. So you start with poor mental health and you use drugs and it makes it worse. You start with poor physical health and you use drugs and alcohol and it makes it worse. You use drugs and alcohol and it makes your mental health worse and maybe creates new problems. A lot of people were never psychotic until they started using cocaine and methamphetamine. But most people are going to say, well, I must just be crazy. And they're not gonna believe because the experiences are so powerful. There's no way in the world that could just be the drugs because I used cocaine for 10 years and now all of a sudden I'm really crazy. And it's hard to imagine that it was just the cumulative effect of the cocaine that creates it. But really what it is there was an underlying condition of instability, of mental health instability, and it gets worse and worse and worse. The more drugs you use, the more vulnerable you become. And then it's like a perfect storm of underlying condition, plus new problems like legal charges, and you know, being on probation, and then estrangement from family, which makes your mental health even more vulnerable, and then the experience of the physical and neurological experience of the drugs and alcohol just is too much, and then the perfect storm hits, and then you're really devastated. And really what we're talking about here is the experience of late stage drug addiction is the story of devastation. Teaser alert, a really good working definition, a non-scientific working definition for addiction is you take a hard look at a behavior or the use of substances and you say, is it making my life unmanageable? And the answer is a resounding yes. Physically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually. So part of the role of a discussion of trauma and mental health in a group like this is to establish, where was I baseline and why? When I first started using drugs at age 8 or 9 or 12 or 18, where was I? What were the conditions that led me? Was it just blind luck and then all of a sudden I was off to the races? Or were there things going on in my mind and in my psychology and in my environment that not only predisposed me to using drugs, but also set me up for one hell of a roller coaster ride, and here we are. So the experiences of using drugs biologically are great strain and toll on your body. You take a mind that has already been strained and is near the breaking point, and you add drugs and alcohol to the mix, there's no way in the world that mind is not going to fracture. It's just not possible. So you come into group with a fractured mind, where it doesn't take much to kind of set you off into a panic attack or into a rage or into hopelessness or into, well, there's just no way in the world that I can ever be cured or fixed or healed. Not true. The farther you let it go, the harder it is. I'm going to tell you that right now. And if you're coming back to group, you know this. I applaud people who come back for more treatment and a reset. But the farther this gets, the harder it gets. The more you fall off the horse, the harder it is to get back on the horse. And then the horse might be like, yeah, I ain't letting you back on. You fall off all the time. Whatever the horse may be. The horse might be your family. It might be a treatment facility. It might be society. It might be your own mind. This is an important conversation because we talk about a story of devastation, but trust me, the postscript is going to be one of great hope and faith that no one is beyond redemption and no one is incorrigible. People generally give up and don't give themselves any more credit. It's not even society that gives up on you. People generally give up on themselves. So speaking of, what are the social experiences of late-stage drug use or alcohol use? Now, society is what? Society is a collection of human beings interacting, creating rules to live by and creating resources to use. In theory, society would have enough resources and would be cooperative enough so that everyone had the ability to survive. I will leave it up to you all to ponder that, to see what you think about your experience of society and how well feel you fit into society and how much room and resources society gives you to maneuver comfortably and safely while you test the waters of trauma, survival, and recovery, and et cetera, et cetera. Yes, sir.
You said what is the to the end game of using?
Yeah. What's the net result, huh?
For me, I see total denial.
So,
As being the end game to the process.
well, so the gentleman is asking about, the role of denial in the end game, and in 12 steps, they the common wisdom is, the end of the line is jails, institutions, and death, and a wiseacre might say, well, we're all going to die, and there's your denial. In 12 steps, they ask, are you going to die from the disease or die with the disease? Teaser alert, a lot of people consider addiction to be a disease. So we're all going to die, that's right. We also, I think, deep down inside, the reason we're survivors is we want to live as long as we can and also try to thrive a little bit. So what does addiction do? What does drug use do? It prevents us from surviving, and it prevents us from thriving. It also promotes denial. So a great barrier to surviving and thriving is denial, and a great barrier to recovery is denial. So the experience of drug use is denial. We got to work through that. Denial on a massive scale. If you're in this room, you're probably not denying that you have a drug problem. You're probably at risk for denying that it's that big of a deal, or that you need help with it, or the actual causes of it. So we're here to work through all of that. The experience socially. What are the social experience of drug use? I mean, a lot of people will say that one day they wake up and they don't even recognize anyone around them because their friends and family, their friends from childhood and their family are gone. And they're led to believe that they're gone because, well, I'm a drug addict and they're not. They're good and I'm bad. That's a story of black and white, black and white thinking. But there's some truth to it. There's an element of truth. Yeah, non-drug addicts generally don't hang out with people who use drugs all the time. And then that leads us to do what? To hang out with a crowd that we may have never envisioned. I mean, I tell you what, if you had asked me at age 15, when I might have had some hope and faith in, I was probably deluded by the vision of success in America. If you could have somehow shown me the types of folks that I was hanging out with at age 25, I might have raised an eyebrow. It was a pretty rough crowd. Then again, you might have looked at the people I was starting to hang out with at age 15 or 16, and you would have said, aha, that looks about right. I was at a Halloween celebration at an elementary school last night, and there's a gift of recovery, taking your child to a Halloween. And one of my little guy's buddies is a pretty wide open kid, ADHD style 8-year-old. And I'm sure a lot of experts would say, that kid's at risk for trouble down the road. We'll talk about that dynamic, what puts us at risk for addiction. All I can say right now before we get there is, looking back, I was always at risk for a variety of reasons. And what is that risk? 12 Steps says jails, institutions, and death. It's hard to argue with that. Raise your hand if you've been to jail, prison, if you've courted death, or you've been institutionalized and drugs and alcohol were part of the process. So kind of hard to argue with that logic. So if the late stage experience of addiction is the end of the road and denial is part of it, we have to look at that, and that's what we're looking to avoid, or we're looking to avoid a return to. So socially, using drugs puts us in harm's way, might put us around dangerous people. We might become dangerous people. It also tends to make us isolate. And there are few things more dangerous to a human being than isolation, because of what it does to your mind and your notion of your sense of inclusion in the human race. We're going to talk later about how every human being is social, whether you like it or not. I know lots of people have chosen deliberately to isolate themselves. It's unclear to me how helpful that is, and I have, as the Brits say, oodles of scientific and anecdotal evidence of what isolation does to a human being's mind.
I had a family member to try to teach me how to not isolate myself to become a functional addict. It was so funny because she's a functional, she can smoke and get high all night long and get up and go to work in the mornings and work all day and come back home and start getting high again. And that's, I look at her and she answers her phone, she talks to her, I can't talk on the phone.
So the group member is talking about what is mythologically known as a functioning drug addict. I'll dispel that right now. If you're using drugs and alcohol like that, you're not functioning properly. You just might be functioning better than you, who can't, so this person goes to work, gets high, still answers the phone. I mean, one wonders what kind of life that really is. That's like the myth of multitasking. There's no such thing as a good multitasker. There's just someone who's better at multitasking than other people. When you use drugs and alcohol and it dominates your life, your way of life, you're not really functioning the way that human beings are supposed to function.
Right.
You're just functioning better than the person who's drooling, passed out, and can't answer their phone. Neither of those people is functioning. Talking about denial, calling someone a functioning drug addict, or referring to yourself as a functioning drug addict, that is an enormous, source of denial. It's a type of denial.
Okay.
It's denying that there's a different way to function. It's a gross misrepresentation of term functionality. We are going to talk about best case scenario for human functioning, and it's not in isolation. Human beings function properly when they have meaningful relationships and a somewhat positive view of their role in society. The experience of using drugs and alcohol and why we experience that experience is devastating socially. We are social creatures, no matter whether you like it or not, we are social creatures. If you take inclusion and validation and connection away from a human being, you are robbing them of their humanity. And this is what the authorities do when they lock people up, because they're putting them in a artificial society that is deliberately toxic. And then, of course, the greatest punishment within the prison system is isolation. There's a really good book called Solitary. It's written by foremost an incarceration psychiatrist. It's a really good book, and it talks about what happens to human beings when they are isolated. So whether you are isolated in the prison system or outside in the so-called real world, and you don't have proper connection to human beings, it tends to take a toll. And this is what using does. The experience of using isolates you. Or it isolates you from healthy society because you're amongst a bunch of people who are doing the same thing. So it is a form of functionality, but it's certainly not functional functionality, if that makes sense. It's a delusion to say that you're a functional drug addict. It's a total delusion. It's like comparing apples and oranges. I'm functional compared to Home Slice, who can barely get up because he's so high. But how are you compared to someone who's in recovery and taking care of themselves and taking care of their grandchildren? I mean, well, you're not functioning very well at all. And why is that?
Right.
Because drugs and alcohol rob you of your ability to think and feel properly and create meaningful relationships. And then finally, what are the spiritual experiences of late-stage drug addiction or using drugs or drug abuse? Well, first you would have to define what spirituality is, and spirituality is, well, everything else except for bio, psycho, and social. It is, your spirit is the seat of your character, your morals and your ethics, your view of the meaning of life, your ability to make meaning out of life. Why are we here? Where do we go? Your spirituality is your ability to practice the principles of spirituality. And what are the principles of spirituality? We're going to talk a lot more in the program about spirituality, but for now we'll talk about things like honesty and gratitude and patience and integrity and compassion. The using way of life robs you of your ability to practice spiritual principles. People generally do things like lie, cheat, and steal when they're using drugs late stage. In fact, what drugs do is they erode your sense of morality and ethics. You start living by a different sense, a different code, a code of survival.
Right.
A gross misrepresentation of social Darwinism. We all know what that's like in the drug life. It's kind of like dog eat dog world, right? Kill or be killed. Got to get mines. Look out for number one. We have a lot of time on our hands to talk about what a proper nourished, healed spirit feels like in real life. What are some words that describe using drugs every day? The intersection between your spirituality and your psychology is very, very close. What are the feelings and experiences of using drugs every day in terms of spirituality? If spirituality is about faith and hope and love and compassion, using drugs every day, or using drugs to the point where it's